4 years ago. I remember she was wearing a very big red hat. And Carolyn I met because I was having a book launch, and she came to my book launch as a journalist writing for the local expat newspaper. So that's how we met. And now I'd like to introduce you to Carolyn, who will read an extract from her wonderful memoir, Black and Abroad. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Joe, and thank you, and for everybody. Wow, thank you guys all for coming. I'm going to read. I brought 2 books today. The first 2 books I ever signed and gave away were to my daughters, Chloe and Paige. So I thought it would only be fitting that I read an extract from one of their books. Before I get started, I wanted to ask, how many of you have ever been to Spain? And I have picked the right excerpt to read. This is also not a painful one. Well, the experience was quite painful, but the scene that I wrote in the book is quite funny, and even I laugh at it now, so excuse me if I start laughing. Okay. Okay. I'd always assumed that since I was fluent in Spanish and was familiar with Latin American literature, I would fit right into the Spanish way of life. Lord, how wrong could I be? One of the first lessons I learned about the Spanish, at least the Madrileños, or people from Madrid, was that they were language snobs, which didn't go down too easily because I spoke Spanish fluently. Back in DC, native speakers had trouble placing my accent. I was variously from Colombia, or Panama, or even Cuba. Were the Madrileños impressed with my proficiency? No, not in the slightest. They expected me to speak with their accent and had no qualms about correcting mine. It was one thing to correct grammatical errors and quite another to try to change my accent. Was this a black thing? I started asking myself. No, it couldn't be. It must have been a Spanish thing, because my dear friend and roommate, Claudia, who was also studying in Alcalá, had informed me that comments had been made about her accent, and she was from Argentina. And because she was from Argentina, she had been allowed to teach beginning level Spanish to undergraduate exchange students, while I, the lowly, non-native speaking American, was banished to the Department of Language's dungeon-like basement with no windows. Dutch people can appreciate how miserable that was. Where I would while away the time waiting to help exchange students struggling with their courses. I tried hard to hold back the indignation because, after all, I was an experienced language teacher preparing for her doctoral exams. The only positive thing about my job was that I had lots of downtime. A typical day went something like this. I'd report to the dungeon around 9:30 a.m. I'd hang out until 11, chatting with other graduate students. Then a group of us would go to a nearby restaurant and eat tortilla, crusty bread, drink café con leche, and smoke cigarettes. We'd go back to the office until about 2 o'clock, at which time we'd all return to our rooms for a 2-hour siesta. I'd go back around 4:30 and twiddle my thumbs for another hour before leaving for the day. The whole 8 months, I never spoke to one student. In the meantime, my own research had been stymied by the university's Department of Bureaucracy. Before we'd arrived in Spain, Claudia, whose brilliance transcends her doctorate in Latin American literature, had gotten me pumped up to discover a nugget of information that would make my dissertation on the representations of the black female body in 19th century Cuban literature stand out. She was certain there were records about the slave trade in the Spanish National Archives. In the years I'd gotten to know her, I'd come to trust her knowledge. And if she said those records were there, then I believed her. I was determined to let nothing come between me and my nugget. Then again, I hadn't counted on needing an official letter from an accredited university verifying my status as a scholar conducting research, which of course I didn't have. So for weeks, literally for weeks, I walked around the city of Alcalá de Henares trying to get this person to write the letter, that person to sign it, and the other to vouch for me. Invariably, she had already left for the day at 11 o'clock a.m. He didn't have the authority, and they weren't familiar with the procedure, and por favor, señorita, vuelva usted mañana. No, I'm not going to come back tomorrow. I felt like screaming. This had gone on for weeks, since, for the Spanish, tomorrow apparently means a few days. By the time I got the blasted letter, I was so disgusted with the runaround, it took me another few weeks to even get the energy to go to the archives. Nor were the Madrileños the warmest of people, even though they affectionately greeted each other with a peck on each cheek. Since they're historically, culturally, and even genetically connected to Latin America, I expected them to embrace me as easily as my friends from Mexico, Argentina, El Salvador, and Nicaragua had done. But then again, Madrid is a metropolitan capital city in Europe, and its people weren't exactly famous for their kindness to strangers. One more small bit and then I'm done. Even New Yorkers tended to be nicer. On this, they were nicer than the people in Madrid.
Don't tell them in Spanish.
Nobody's Spanish, I hope. On this point, I'd had many conversations with other international graduate students there who uniformly criticized us Americans for being fake. You meet an American and immediately they introduce you as their friend, said a woman from Paraguay on one occasion. Well, that's probably because introducing someone as an acquaintance is just too formal, I replied a bit defensively. I think you're just confusing friendliness with an offer of friendship. They're two totally different things. Anyway, what's so wrong with being friendly? I concluded. More than once I'd been put off by what I took as rudeness. Walking down the street, for example, I'd said, "Buenos dias," to passers-by, only to be greeted by blank stares and silence. I'd asked one of my Spanish colleagues down in the dungeon why his people didn't respond to my cheerful smiles. "Why would you smile at a stranger?" was his response. And I let it go at that, and my point proved.